Yes, thanks. So in terms of, obviously Brexit's the big issue at the moment out there and what's happening, but I just want to start first with kind of given the backdrop, because it has already happened amongst a fairly uncertain backdrop in the global economy. So if you look at what the OECD had estimated for growth over the next couple of years, in terms of global growth, they didn't expect any huge acceleration in it. So what's happened in the global economy over the last 3 to 4 years is that, emerging markets have slowed. China especially. China's gone from a rate of 10% to below 7%. Brazil, Russia have gone into recessions, and advanced economies have picked up modestly. So net, there hasn't been any huge change in global growth. But what we've seen since the start of this year is very fragile market sentiment. So in the first week of the year, equity markets were down 5 to 6%. Currencies were some volatility in currency markets, and a reason for that was there's concerns over emerging markets. Is there an emerging market debt crisis? There's concerns over how effective can monetary policy be and deal with any sort of slowdown in the global economy. And then on top of that, obviously since the start of the year, we had more focus coming on Brexit. But the overall growth picture has been pretty subdued in the global economy for the last number of years. And the vote for Brexit has happened against an already very uncertain backdrop for the global economy. But we can see the immediate impact that Brexit had. So in the lead up to the vote, a couple of hours before the actual official vote was announced, we saw markets got ahead of themselves. So markets started to price in a Remain vote. They based that on a couple of opinion polls that were out during the week, and at 10 o'clock when the actual official voting closed, we had one last on the day opinion poll which showed a 52 to 48 in favour of Remain. Now, as it turned out, it was flipped around the other way. So markets moved to price it in. So sterling against the dollar moved up to $1.50. And then as the night progressed, within a matter of hours, we saw the huge change from that, and we saw an over 10% fall in sterling against the dollar. So it went from 150 down to 133. Now, overnight again, we've seen more of that volatility. So sterling against the dollar in overnight Asia trading just last night traded as low as 128. So it's really in the currency markets where we're seeing the immediate impact of the Brexit vote and the uncertainty that it involves. So if we look at it then from a euro perspective, what we've seen is that obviously sterling weakness has been broad-based, so it hasn't just been against the dollar. So as Aidan mentioned in his chart there, we've seen euro sterling trade back up towards 85, 86p. And we're kind of at the levels where we are in 2011. So I think that's an important point to bear in mind. It's not that long ago where euro sterling was trading at these levels. So a lot of you have experience of dealing and selling into the UK and buying from the UK where euro sterling has been around these rates. But also it's important to look for from a euro dollar perspective as well, because a UK exit from the European Union is a negative, a key negative for the European Union, but it also puts some risks and cause into concern the overall structure of the European Union and then in turn the Eurozone. So what we did see in the couple of weeks leading up to the vote, where the polls were very close, was some euro weakness against the dollar. So, we had been trading in a 110 to 114 range, and more recently now we're back down to that 110 and even below that 110 range against the dollar. So the impact of the Brexit vote is having a dampening impact on the euro against the dollar as well in terms of the exchange rate. So we are seeing some weakening, albeit more modest, of the euro against the dollar. But the key thing is the outlook from a currency perspective. So we think sterling is vulnerable to further falls because there's a backdrop of both political and economic uncertainty. So as Breach outlined there, the process itself could take a minimum of 2 years. I think that can be extended. What sort of trade deal is put in place? Obviously, we have a lot of political uncertainty in the UK at the moment, and no one knows for sure when Article 50 will be triggered. So there's a whole raft of uncertainty around from an economic and political perspective. On top of that as well, from a currency perspective, an important thing to bear in mind is that the Bank of England has given strong signals that it could ease monetary policy. So this could take the form of interest rate cuts or re-engaging and increasing its quantitative easing programme. So if a central bank loosens monetary policy, cuts interest rates or expands its balance sheet, it tends to be a negative for the currency. So those three things combined in terms of political, economic uncertainty, a Bank of England that potentially could loosen monetary policy is going to put further downward pressure on the currency. And the big thing will be is what sort of an outcome we have. I suppose we've tried to term it here an orderly EU exit and a disorderly EU exit. So in a more orderly exit, we still think it's a weakening aspect for sterling because it's still a negative impact for the UK economy. So this is the midpoint of our range here in terms of 86p. So in that scenario, we're nearly at that at the moment, but it's an 84 to 88p range we think euro sterling could trade on that. But the other thing too is to bear in mind is that it still does have a negative impact for the euro against the dollar. So we do see the euro dollar trading down towards the 107 range on that type of an outcome. I think the key thing though is that if it's a disorderly EU exit, if the process drags on for a number of years, if there's no satisfactory trade deal put in place and the fallback option of the World Trade Organization procedures are in place there, then that could bring more profound weakness for sterling. So euro sterling in that scenario could trade up towards 90p and go above that. But likewise, if that gets messy and it drags on, issues for the European Union and also the Eurozone are there in terms of the negativity. So that does weaken the euro against the dollar as well. So euro dollar could trade down towards 105. So that's kind of the lows we were last year in those currencies. So I suppose the key thing to take away from this is that, okay, euro is gaining against sterling because sterling is so weak, but the uncertainty could have a dampening impact on the euro against the dollar too, because currency markets will tend to look for safe haven, stronger currencies amid a lot of uncertainty, and in that basis the dollar should get some support, whereas the euro could weaken. So then if we look at the actual macro picture and what's involved, now this is a busy chart here, a lot of text on it. I suppose it's indicative of all the issues that are at play in relation to it. So if we look first from the UK perspective, and this is an important thing to bear in mind, is that the UK's very close relationship and its high level of dependence with the EU. So roughly 44% of all UK exports go to the EU. But when you look at it from the other side, only 10% of EU exports go to the UK. So from a trade perspective, the EU is much more important to the UK than the UK is to the EU. And this is going to be important in the negotiation process in terms of bargaining power. Another key thing is that the UK has a large trade deficit with the EU. So the UK itself, 50% of UK's own exports come from the European Union, and a lot of these are intermediate goods used in day-to-day manufacturing and development of products and services. Another thing to bear in mind is FDI. So the UK is the largest recipient of foreign direct investment in the EU, and the remainder chunk comes from the US in terms of 30%. So some of this could be vulnerable given the uncertainty over is the UK going to have access to the single market or not. And a lot of issues, and it's a very emotive issue around migration and immigration policy, but so, from a macro perspective, the important thing to bear in mind is that skills shortages in the UK economy, that these migrant flows are needed to address many of the skills shortages that are there around science, IT and language skills in the UK economy. So it's not suddenly a situation where the UK, from a macro perspective at least, could cope without these inflow of migrant workers. The other thing as well is London. Obviously London is predominantly the centre of financial services for the EU, but if the UK does actually leave the European Union, then a lot of these financial services may have to be based within the EU to be able to access the single market. So the big thing really is trade, and it depends on what sort of a trade agreement is put in place between the UK and the EU. So As you look to increase your sovereignty, there's a trade-off with how much trade, market access, integration you can have. So the closest thing to being a member of the EU without actually being in there is what's, as Bríd mentioned already, is the Norway model. So that's basically, you sit within the European Economic Area, which is 3 countries, including Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and the 28 EU countries. And to access the single market, you adhere to all the rules and regulations. You still make a budgetary contribution, but you no longer sit around the table where a lot of those decisions are made. So it's the closest thing to being in the EU without being in the EU. But at that point, you can see, well, your increasing level of sovereignty is very minimal. If they want to increase their sovereignty further, then there's a trade-off with having that market access. And the concern from an Irish economy perspective is that we could end up with the World Trade Organization procedures, which involve tariffs and non-tariff barriers for trade. So most economic models that assess this show that it's a negative impact for the UK economy. And in the short term, the reports suggest that the UK economy could be somewhere in the region of 3% weaker by 2018. So if we look at it then from an Irish economy perspective, obviously our economy is very close trade and economic links with the UK. So if you include our exports and our imports, our trade with the UK equates to roughly 35% of our GDP. So a negative impact on UK growth means that the UK will buy less goods and services generally, which means they'll buy less goods and services from Ireland. So that's where our big negative impact will come in through trade, but also through sterling. So the key from an Irish economy perspective is what the trade arrangement is put in place post a UK exit. So ideally, the UK would remain part of the EEA and go down the Norway model, because that would mean that they'd still have access to the single market, they still adhere to the rules and regulations. So from a day-to-day trading business perspective, between Ireland and the UK, there wouldn't be any great deal of change involved that. So that would be the ideal situation, apart from if they decided not to leave at all. But if they do end up leaving, the Norway model is very much the ideal situation from an Irish economy perspective. Obviously, if other trade arrangements are put in place, you could look at higher trading costs. So this is where it really starts to hit. So it's not just the tariffs, it's the non-tariff barriers that could have the biggest impact in terms of day-to-day trade, increased paperwork, differential trade rules between Ireland, what we sell into the EU, and different trade rules with what we're selling to the UK, potential customs posts. So the impact too on cross-country investment, because there's a lot of, in terms of the energy market, it's predominantly an all-Ireland energy market, and obviously here today the agri-food sector, but also tourism, energy, and I know someone here from retailing as well, financial sector, all these will be impacted if the UK does decide to leave. The other big issue is Northern Ireland, the border there, and if it's a situation where it's a hard border, where there's customs posts, that's going to cause a lot of difficulty. So we've done a number of presentations before the referendum in the north, and just the feedback you get from people there, and the amount of people that live one side of the border and work the other side of the border, and the amount of business they do on a day-to-day basis, and the concerns around that. So that could be a huge issue. And obviously, as I mentioned, sterling. So the two biggest negative impacts for the Irish economy from this are a weaker UK economy. It buys less goods and services, but also from the perspective of weaker sterling makes our goods selling into the UK more expensive. But even at EU level as well, important thing to bear in mind is we lose a close political ally if the UK does vote to leave. So many of our interests have been closely aligned down through the years. The UK offers a different perception on things, maybe compared to the France and Germany. So to lose that voice in the EU is a negative, but also from an Irish economy perspective and an Irish diplomatic perspective, to lose the UK as a close political ally is not an ideal situation. So to put numbers on growth, so we think that growth will be lower in 2017, 2018. So we were previously forecasting growth of around 5% this year, 4.5% next year, and 4% in 2018. So we've lowered that over those 3 years by roughly 2% in terms of our growth forecast. So we're still forecasting growth this year of around 4.7%, 3.5% next year, and 3% in 2018. So the main negative drag from that is the slower UK economy and the impact of a weaker sterling against the euro. But you can see, though, that those growth rates are still pretty strong strong, and many other European and Eurozone countries would like to have those growth rates that are being projected over the next couple of years. Big thing, the most immediate thing, is the currencies, and that's where there is a lot of volatility. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague now, John Sheils, and he's just going to talk around different strategies to manage some of that volatility that's there in currency markets. John.
Thanks very much, John. As you can see from the heading of the presentation, hedging for uncertainty, I think, is very much what we have to look at. I suppose just as a context, and I said most of the speakers have covered it before, the UK is our second largest export market, and obviously is very key to what we, I suppose, the success of the country. I'll just skip over that one because Aidan actually had a better context. So I suppose what I've done here is I've put up the euro sterling and euro dollar exchange rate, but normalised it from the beginning of 2016. So as you can see, as of last night, although it's got a bit worse this morning, euro dollar is 2% weaker over the course of the year, and sterling is 15, although 16% as of me checking it this morning. I suppose what does that mean from a pound shilling and pence perspective from yourselves? It means that without any hedging in place, your goods are now 16% more expensive from a UK from a UK consumer. Obviously, conversely to that, as Breed was speaking earlier on, the UK is still a member of the EU and will be for the next 2 years in all likelihood. So what UK producers have is they now have a 16% competitive advantage on you in our market. So while a lot of what we've been talking about is obviously the export market and how you can, I suppose, protect yourself when selling into the UK, you do need to bear in mind that all of a sudden now there is a competitive advantage for UK firms actually selling into Ireland. So even those firms that may not necessarily be competing in an international stage may actually find some additional pressure, I suppose, on the domestic market. I suppose, first of all, to let you know, there will be workshops which are being ran on the 20th of June, and I think you can sign up for them now at the minute on the Board BA website, and I'll be partaking in it. And what we'll be focusing there, I'll be getting far more into the nuts and bolts of how you hedge, good hedging strategies, and just, I suppose, getting into what works for specific companies. But for those that, I suppose, may not be able to make it on the day, I just wanted, I suppose, throw up some what you might think are fairly obvious steps, but as you'll see in a second, maybe not everyone does them. So obviously you want to analyse what currencies you want to consider, review clauses into your contract. You also, I said, going back as a story from several years ago, I remember you want to make sure that your sales department and your finance department are actually talking continuously. I remember, for example, a sales department had been negotiating a contract with a UK retailer for about 6 months. When he actually came back to tell the finance director that the thing was actually done and agreed, euro sterling had actually moved a couple of percent in the meantime. The sales guy hadn't actually reflected that in the sales price, and unfortunately then they were locked into a 3-year contract on the back of it. So just make sure that there is ongoing dialogue between the sales teams and the finance teams to ensure that it's live, I suppose, market pricing is being fed into sales terms. Plan ahead, look at your order book. Obviously consider any offsetting flows that may be coming in from the other side if any of your imports are linked to sterling, and look and see if there's any natural hedging. I suppose above all else, don't ignore the currency risk. Quite often I'll hear companies saying, oh, well, you know, the swings and roundabouts, it works its way back. As you've seen in previous graphs, euro sterling hasn't been at these levels since for the last 3 years. Particularly if you look at dollar sterling, we're at 127 this morning. It's 31 years since we were last at those levels. So, you know, swings and roundabouts do happen, but they can happen over prolonged periods of time, and you need to make sure that your company can actually protect itself and manage over that period while, I suppose, swings and roundabouts are taking place. So, as I said, the previous steps, you might have thought that they were fairly obvious, but this is actually from the Irish Exporters Association, did a survey of their members back in 2014. They haven't updated it since, but to be honest with you, my gut feeling is it probably hasn't changed. So I've always just been struck by these two graphs. Has your financial performance been affected by sterling and dollar fluctuations? Nearly 60% say yes. Do you plan to hedge these currencies? Over 60% no. And it just has never made particular sense to me why you wouldn't put some level of cover, some level of protection to make sure that, as I said, while you may have a view of swings and roundabouts, it just doesn't make sense to leave yourself completely exposed. The next graph I'll just show you, it probably looks a bit busy. John, I suppose, has already gone into AIB's forecasts for where we expect things to be. You know, euro sterling to 86 on an orderly Brexit basis, rising to 90 on a disorderly basis. Bearing in mind we're already at 85 as of this morning. So what this does is, this is Bloomberg, and they take the forecasts from the top 100 global banks, and they plot them, and they work on a probability basis. And as you can see, what I've done is just highlighted on the left-hand side there for 2017. So they're forecasting a range, sorry, not forecasting a range, just from a pure probability point of view, they're saying they can only say with 76% probability that the range will be somewhere between 72 and 99. Now, do we forecast it'll get there? No, certainly that's not AIB's house view. But what I'm saying is, leaving yourself completely exposed just in case something like that happens is, to my mind, seems fairly nuts. What sort of products can you use? As I said, I'm going to cover these in an awful lot more detail at the workshops on the 20th of June, but as I said, for those who can't make it, you know, spot is essentially unhedged. It's taking the movements as your funds arrive. Unfortunately, as we can see, what has happened since the start of the year, you know, funds that might have been booked in January are now worth 16% less come now if you haven't done anything about it. There's no cost to it. There's no breakage cost. Forward contracts, you're locked in. You know what the rate is. There's no gain, there's no loss. You're locked in on it, and that's exactly what you're going to get. So at least you have certainty on what the Eurowise amount is going to be. Purchase FX option. An FX option is literally, it's like an insurance policy. It's just you pay a premium up front and you have the right but without the obligation to exchange your money at a certain period of time in the future. So you can have certainty, but you have the ability to gain. However, I said in exchange for that you have to pay a premium up front. And then I said tailored FX option, everything there is a question mark. There is umpteen different structures you can put together based on your specific needs. But I said we can get into far more detail during the workshops. The one thing I just want to focus on here, because I said it's quite often, it's probably one of the most common things I hear of when I'm talking to people about why they're not using forward contracts or putting some level of cover in place. And that is, I just don't have certainty of when I'm going to get my money. I know I'm going to get it, but I just don't know when it's going to arrive. And I suppose people have in their head that a forward contract, you name, I want to exchange that on the 20th of August and that's it. That's not how it works. You can do these things called window forward contracts, and there's nothing magic about them. But what it is you give a window, a period. So you can say, you know what, I've got money and it's going to arrive sometime in October. Can I get a forward contract for that? Yes, you can. I've got money. Actually, I don't know when it's going to arrive. It's going to arrive sometime before Christmas. Can I get a contract for that? Yes, you can. There's no optionality to it. It just is there's a flexibility around when the deliverable, when the actual funds will be delivered. So don't let uncertainty over the timing of it. Once you have certainty over the flow, don't let uncertainty about the timing preclude you from actually engaging in some hedging. I suppose, lastly, what I just wanted to cover here was, I suppose, a sample hedging policy. Like, you know, for someone who's just starting, where would you start? What sort of cover would you put in place? And what I like to do, as a very simple one, as you can see here, as you go through each quarter, what you do is you cover out a quarter of your exposure for each of the next 4 quarters. So after this is done for a period of time, just look there. By the time you get to quarter 3, 2017, for example, you will now have by the time you enter into that quarter, you'll have 3 quarters of your exposure covered. And you can then fine-tune it as you go along. So, you know, to reflect, maybe you're selling more, selling less, whatever it is, but you can fine-tune it because you're only adding a quarter every time. But what you end up with is you end up with a blended rate. And, you know, the benefit of this is there's no shocks. just like what Breed was saying earlier on about the exit, like no one wants a shock of the UK leaving the EU. So, everyone will work towards not having that shock. And this is, again, just a way of not having a shock. This gives you time to adjust your prices. This gives you time to find new markets. This gives you time to find new customers. So no matter what happens, you will always have a certain amount of currency locked in. And you have the ability, as I said, to gain a certain amount of benefit if the exchange rate has moved in your favour. But it always gives you just that bit of certainty that's there to allow for changes. So as I said, that's my contact details. We will be having the workshops on the 20th of June, and I'll be around later on for any questions, either during the panels or after the presentation if anyone has any. Thank you very much.